It's about language, actually. My interest in the past really came about through an interest in history and language. And when I went to university, really, I just looked around to think, what is the oldest language you can learn? So a lot of people who get into Egyptology are really, really interested in Egypt. But for me, originally, the interest was in the old language. So it's whether it's an aptitude, but certainly it was an interest in language and the past, put them together, and it took me to ancient Egypt. Oh, it certainly has. It has in three obvious ways. I mean, first of all, the longer you read an ancient language, the more experience you get. So that's the first thing. And that experience breeds a kind of confidence. So when you're a younger person and you're reading a text and perhaps you've read other translations of this text and you don't agree with them, the tendency is to assume that's my fault. I'm misunderstanding something. The older you get, you bring that experience and with it the confidence to be able to see, well, hang on, maybe it's not me that's wrong. Maybe other people are missing the point here slightly. And then the third aspect of that is knowledge. The longer you uh, read in a particular language, the more you will have read in that language. And so you begin to make connections between texts. You begin to understand what a particular phrase means because you've seen it used in another text. And so the interconnections also built into that experience. Experience builds confidence and so on. So there is no substitute for reading in a language. It would be very easy to say they always surprise me. But actually, there are two spring to mind when you ask that question, and they stand at either end of this recorded history of the Egyptian language. One would be the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, which is a Coptic text from the 5th century AD. And these are the sayings, the wisdom of the men and women who were responsible for founding the monastic movement, which, of course, spread to Europe and became so foundational in Western culture. And I was first introduced to these texts as an undergraduate student. They look like a little bit of nonsense from the past. I found it kind of quite whimsical. I found them quite charming, but inherently silly. 20 years later, I went back to them, and maybe as an older person myself with more life experience, then I saw them through a different set of eyes, and suddenly I saw that they were full of wisdom. They were full of meaningful statements about the human condition and the relationships between people and how people can work together to build really meaningful communities. But right at the other end of the written history of ancient Egypt, going right back to the third dynasty, the earliest inscribed tomb which has survived is the tomb of a man called Mechen, who was buried within walking distance of the famous step pyramid of King Joseph at Saqqara outside Cairo. And he served Joseph. He would have seen the step pyramid being built. And when I read his tomb inscription, I just thought, well, this is interesting because it's the oldest inscription. But when I read it, it was just the extraordinary story of this man who was actually responsible for hydraulic engineering on a massive scale. And we see at the beginning of pharaonic culture, the impact that human activity had on the indigenous species, for example, on the environment, the drainage of the Nile Delta and so on. And this man, Mechen, turns out to have been the sort of the driving force behind at least one generation of that work. So reading the autobiography of Mechen, expecting to see the usual kind of stuff you might see in an ancient Egyptian inscription, and suddenly being shown the very beginning of pharaonic culture and the extraordinary activity that they were capable of in building a state from scratch. All of that contained in one man's tomb. That was quite an extraordinary experience for me, I have to say. Throughout the whole of my career, at least until recently, I made sure I was always teaching. And I've always tried to teach in two environments, to teach inside the university and also to teach extramurally, so that people would come into the university to learn about something just because they were interested to learn about it. And because of that, I've always had this mixed learning environment where you've got students who are doing the module because they're obliged to do the module, and students who have come from outside the university because they are really determined to find out about this subject which fascinates them, and all spaces in between. So having to deal with that kind of mixed environment of learners and find ways to articulate what it is that they need to know, that's always been fundamental to my working life, as it were. So hopefully that's what comes across. And so if these books have any utility, hopefully it's founded on that experience of trying to explain matters to audiences. I always get feedback through the class, and it tends to be very nice feedback, but that's because it's mostly in person. And I think, most people will hold back from being too critical when they're face to face with you. I don't use social media at all, partly just a function of my age, and partly because probably there's stuff out there I don't want to come across in the first place. There's moral cowardice behind this, perhaps. But yeah, I've had lots of nice feedback over the years, and in the classroom, you get people's honest opinion about how things could be phrased differently, and so on. But and I don't go searching out what people think about my work. Most of it begins in the classroom. So I mean, hopefully, I'm always aware that what I'm trying to do is write about stuff that I know people want to find out about, and whether or not I do it well, in a sense, it's nice to hear back. But once a book's published, there's not much you can usually do to change it anyway. So that's just the nature of the creature. The oldest book in the world is really based around two very ancient texts. One, which is an account of creation from ancient Egypt, which is probably arguably the oldest account of creation survives, and also the most important influential philosophical text which has survived from ancient Egypt. I've been aware of both of them for decades. But really in the last decade, perhaps the last 10 years, thinking about both of them and also putting them together, as it were. They don't seem to have any immediate connection, but understanding that the one reflects light on what the other one is talking about, vice versa. Just that awareness, it became more and more compelling to me that I had to write this book. So for better or worse, it really did become something I wanted to do. So I took the proposal to the publisher, and then the publishers, thankfully thought this would be an interesting project to pursue. And of course, at that point, then it's a race against time to get the book done within the terms of contract and so on. But there was very much the bubbling under beforehand. And then, as is the nature of the world now, once the book contracts were signed, COVID hit, and that added a different element to it. So there's a bit of both aspects of that. Ultimately, it became a project which had to be done in a set time period, but its origins are very much in a sense of, this is something I really feel I want to share with people because I think people would be interested. Has changed very much for the better as well. It used to be a real problem to get access to Egyptian texts. Hieroglyphic inscriptions might be in a temple or a tomb, which involves traveling to Egypt or to go to the particular museum collection that it's in, where it may or may not have been on display. Egyptian literary texts tend to be preserved under glass and kept in storage because the potential for damage of different kinds and so on. Getting access to these things can be a real problem. However amenable people in an institution may be, you have to physically get there. But these days, so much of the stuff is digitized and it's available through Creative Commons licenses and so on. So, and of course, with an ancient scroll and ancient inscription, if something's digitized, in many ways you can see it more clearly because you can magnify the thing. You can change the coloration and all sorts of electronic tricks that you can do when the thing is on screen. So yeah, in the last generation, things have changed enormously in terms of me being able to get access to original material, and mostly for the better. There is still, the issue that sometimes you might have to go to Egypt to see something, or something is no longer available. It's difficult, but somebody has to do it sometimes.
Yeah.
But then the other side of it as well is that it's the nature of the subject is such that things have been found that are important over the last 200 years and through world wars, other kinds of difficulty, negligence, whatever else it may be. Sometimes there's things you want to get access to and they don't seem to exist anymore, or certainly nobody seems to be able to pinpoint where these things are. But overall, very much for the better in terms of getting access and the quality of the access that you can get to ancient materials. It's an interesting question, and there's nothing suggests itself to me actually. I can't think of something Holy Grail that suggests itself to me as something I would like to track down. But the most recent book I wrote, the oldest book in the world, is about Egyptian literature. At least that's part of what we're talking about. Uh, when we talk about literature in a culture, we may tend to assume that literature was as important in an ancient culture as it is in our modern culture. And in the modern world, of course, books are everything. So it seems the whole of our modern culture is either the novel or the television adaptation of the novel. But in ancient times, these things were much more specific. And in ancient Egypt, one of the peculiar things to note is that actual literature from ancient Egypt, there's very, very little of it. And nearly all of it, apart from some fragments, was found in the 19th century. So if there's something which springs to mind in response to that particular question, it may be a whole new Egyptian literary text that nobody's ever seen before. But that goes against your question in the sense that I've no reason to believe such a thing does exist. But it's the only thing I can think of which would be nice to come across, which is obviously lacking in my experience at the moment. Writing more is the plan, and I recently left my university specifically so I'd have more time to do the things which I want to do, as it were, and writing is very much at the top of that. So my immediate future is that I have an agreement with University College London to publish my teaching notes in the Coptic language. So those are the notes I've just developed over my career. So that's just a case of clearing the desk, as it were, something that I've been working with for a long time and work on that. And then beyond that, yeah, I've got lots of ideas for books which I would like to get out while I'm still physically able to write books. And of course, one of the problems with any academic career is that you turn around and 30 years went by without you noticing, and all of those things you were going to do one day, you suddenly begin to wonder whether you'll ever get round to doing them. So I want to prioritize getting out of me those books which I've always imagined I would get around to one day. So writing is very much the future, but thank you for asking.